It's car con carne. Let's eat in the car. It's car con carne. And now here's the star of our show, James Van Alstyne.
Okay, this right here is Car Con Carne. It's a Q101 podcast. I'm James Van Oslo, and Car Con Carne is sponsored by Easy Automation, easy-automation.net. Transform your living space with cutting-edge home automation. Experience seamless control over audio, video, lighting, climate, security, and more. Embrace the future of smart living. It's your home, your rules. Get a quote by visiting easy-automation.net or give my friend Dan a call. Call him directly. This is his phone number. His phone will vibrate when you call this, 630-730-3728. Recording at Livewire Lounge, 3394 North Milwaukee, a favorite dive bar, a favorite neighborhood Chicago bar of mine. To my right, if you're watching this on video, even if you're listening, he is still on my right. He is author, he is writer, Josh Noel, whose most recent book is about a Chicago book, as you'll find. Here it is. It is Malört, The Redemption of a Revered and Reviled Spirit. That's about as local as it gets. The history of Malört. I guess first question for you, Josh. I would ask, what made you want to write this? But I kind of feel like the answer is, if you didn't, someone else was going to. Like, the story had to be told.
When I had the idea to write it, my first thought was, thank God no one got to this before me. I'm so glad I thought of this when I did, because you're exactly right. If I didn't, someone else probably would have. Yeah.
For a lot of reasons. One, it's a very Chicago story. It's a very interesting story. Like, this could be read as a Chicago story. This could be read as a business story. I see the red thread of this book as loyalty. Loyalty from the perspective of the owners who Malört has changed hands through very slowly through the decades. Also, loyalty from the consumer. Brand loyalty. Yeah.
No, I love that. The word I usually think of is it's a love story, believe it or not. And a couple people have tapped into that along the way, which is super cool. But this is the first time that anyone has sort of put it through that filter. And I would say loyalty is another sort of version of love,
sure.
Right? So I love that, and I completely agree. And it's really, when I was working on the book, and I'd say I'm writing a book about Malört, people would say, oh, is it a history of the brand? And I'd say, sort of. Kinda, but it's more than that. My thing is that any good narrative can't just be about a thing. Things are only so interesting. What's interesting are people and relationships. And happiness and sadness and drama and tragedy and all those things. And it turned out that that's all imbued in the story of Malört. And it just so happens that the thing in this case is this really fascinating thing that Chicago loves and hates and loves to hate and just has this really interesting, complicated relationship with. But then there are also these really interesting and complicated relationships behind the scenes as well.
I've always felt that the reaction to Malört, to its taste, maybe a little overblown. Where do you stand?
Well, I like it. I authentically enjoy it. So
here it is.
There it is. Take it down. Are we going to get a Malört face?
No, I like it.
Yeah, I like it too. I get it. It is different than what people are usually looking for in something they eat or drink. People usually want things that taste good, right? Malört is not conventionally good. Mm-hmm. So that often throws people for a loop, and I get that. But I do think we're also, a lot of people will taste it. I've seen people take a lot of first tastes over these last few months since the book came out, and it's been very fun. And a lot of people say, oh, that's not as bad as I thought it was going to be. But plenty of people do still authentically really dislike it. It is bitter. I mean, it's bitter. It's astringent. It does. I always think of it as tasting like grapefruit pith and rubber bands. But
it is.
Yeah, no, I like it. And yeah, I mean, part of the fun is the lore and the reaction,
for sure,
right? And that's it's part of the narrative. And I don't mean the narrative of the book. I mean the narrative of what Malört is, and that's part of why people enjoy it.
It's the identity.
Yeah. So let them have their fun.
For someone, just starting with the basics, for someone who's never had Malört, you kind of described it, the astringent, bitter, but what is this as a spirit it goes?
It's very simple, actually. So it's neutral spirit, meaning basically vodka, aged on wormwood, which is a bitter herb, and then it gets some sugar to balance it out. So this is basically an expression of wormwood. So it's very herbal, and wormwood is bitter, so it's very bitter too. But yeah, it's really a very simple product and has a lot of precedent through generations and generations, and especially European drinking culture, a digestif kind of thing, settles the stomach after dinner, sort of gets the taste buds going, gets the stomach going. Wormwood is believed to have medicinal properties. I am a firm believer that it does settle the stomach after you eat too much, which is actually how I even came to have the idea for the book. I keep a bottle at home, unironically, because I enjoy it. And one night after too large of a meal,
which is what we do in Chicago.
Darn right, buddy. I cracked my bottle of Malört to sort of settle the stomach and poured the shot in my kitchen. Took that shot down and thought, I wonder if there's a book in this. Because I'd done one book before about the beer industry, and
that book is Barrel Aged Stout and Selling Out.
Goose Island, Anheuser-Busch, and how craft beer became big business. Yes. So I was sort of casting about for the second book when I had that. It was just one of those holy crap light bulb moments. I wonder if there's a book in this. And it did take 2 or 3 months of calling and sort of talking to those people that we referenced earlier, the people in the relationships. Well, who are the people? Are they interesting? Are there interesting relationships? And it turned out to all be very fascinating. But I didn't know that going in. That did take a few months of reporting to think, yeah, there is actually a pretty interesting story to be told here.
And there are so few players in the history of Malört that had anyone in that chain not agreed to talk to you, it would have been trouble for your book.
Yeah, totally.
I mean, we're talking like 5 main players.
Yeah.
Really, one main player at the end of the day.
Yeah.
Being Pat.
Yeah. And the brand has been owned by, 1, 2, 3, 4 people ever. It's almost 100 years old. It's been owned by 4 people, one of whom, Carl Jeppsson, Swedish immigrant. The Malört it's a Besk, B-E-S-K. That's the style of liquor, popular in southern Sweden. He was from southern Sweden. He introduced it to Chicago.
And he would just go door to door?
Yep, selling it to his fellow Swedes, which was a built-in audience for him. They would say, "Oh, Besk, I haven't seen Besk since the old country." I mean, I'm making that up because obviously I wasn't able to talk to Mr. Jeppsson, but it tracks that there would have been an obvious audience for him there. He sold it to this guy, George Brody, who owned it for 65 years. George died in 1999, left it to his secretary, and then
his secretary / mistress.
Well,
yeah. Paramour.
Yeah, all of the above. And that was one of so we didn't know that the conventional wisdom was that George had left the brand to his secretary, but we didn't know that she was his companion. But that certainly did raise my eyebrow when I thought, I wonder if there's a book here, a deeper story. And so that she's my central character, this woman, Pat Gablick, who's still with us, 81 years young. And yeah, you're right. If Pat, that was my first call basically for the book, and if she hadn't been open to talking with me, which she did many, many times over the course of a couple years, and she also eventually, once we sort of established some trust between us, she said, well, why don't you come over and look through George's old things? So we went into her storage space in the basement of her high-rise and spent a few hours digging through more than a dozen boxes, and she said, just take what you want. So yeah, if without her involvement and openness, and then a handful of other characters, you're right, it would have been pretty hard to write this book. But everyone was very eager to talk about it. It wasn't all happiness. Some demons were exercised along the way, if you can believe it. Not mine, but the characters, and it just sort of all came out in this really surprisingly elaborate narrative.
You mentioned George, the original owner after Carl Jeppsson. This was the only spirit in his portfolio.
So George did own a liquor company when he acquired Malört in 1935. He continued to operate that company until 1953, And at that point, he sold his business, and he also had a law degree from Northwestern, and he just said, I'm going to go just practice law. But he kept one brand out of the portfolio, sold everything, and the one brand, of course, was Jeppson's Malört. Why did he keep Jeppson's Malört? I mean, it's a strange decision, and I asked Pat over and over again. I also was able to talk to George's son, who has since died, but I was, early in my reporting, I talked to him several times, and I asked him, too. Those are really the only two people who knew George intimately that I was able to interview and track down. And I said, why did he keep Malört? And they both said he just found it was his life's hobby. He was so, and whether was he a good businessman? Maybe yes, maybe no. I think he was more of an interesting businessman. He saw Malört as a challenge and something that would be hard to sell, but that fascinated him. And
it was a puzzle to solve.
Exactly, and it became his life's work.
And up through the 20th century, you say it in the book, Malört was just something you found in old man bars.
Yeah, totally.
And then it started to cross over in the 21st century, and that brings us to the present day. In talking to Pat, it seems to me, just from reading this book, again, I'm going to hold it up to the camera. Hopefully I can get this on. Malört, the redemption of a revered and reviled spirit. Pat was an owner who, I mean, she was given the brand, she was given Malört. She wasn't ever necessarily all in on it. It was kind of like, I got to do this.
Yeah, no, she was about half in on it all the way. So, she hated Malört. Still hates Malört. She's one of those people who just thinks it tastes terrible, so why would you ever want to drink it?
Maybe it's like a cilantro thing. Some people can do it, and some people just taste it differently.
I'm not sure too many people taste Malört for the first time and ever like it all that much. I would suspect people are intrigued by it, maybe, but
sure.
Really loving it becomes an acquired taste. But yeah, no, the way she put it is that so George also did not like Malört, but he loved the brand, he loved the challenge, and so George loved Malört. Pat loved George, so when George died, Pat just sort of kept it going to honor George, and it also was a little bit of income for her. She didn't really have much money, and Malört was just on autopilot. George was having it made at a distillery in Florida. The cases would then be shipped to a warehouse in suburban Chicago. The distributor would then pick up the cases and then sell them into the bars. And it was just truly happening on autopilot. She had to do basically nothing. So it did create a little bit of income for her. Even though it was a dying brand, the sales were very, very modest in the first half of her tenure owning Malört. And then, as you point out, then the new audience emerged seemingly out of nowhere, and Malört became this strange
Malört.
hit. Yeah.
Did things almost go off the rails for good? There was a Wormwood issue, like a customs issue.
Yeah, Pat thought it was over. This was before anyone cared about Malört. This was, I want to say, it was in 04, 05, 06 maybe, is no later than that. And that was really before Malört had taken off. And yeah, the Wormwood was imported from Europe, and Wormwood has a chemical compound called thujone, and thujone is the absinthe has this lore and this reputation, and it was sort of quasi-illegal for decades. That's because of the thujone. So some guy at Customs saw, oh, Wormwood, that has thujone. We better get that tested and see. And so Pat's shipment of Wormwood got held up at the border, and she thought that, well, how am I ever going to get this through now? But she persevered, and she sort of combination of hard work and luck, and that's sort of the story of Malört in a nutshell. There's so many times where it could have and really kind of almost should have gone away, but there was just the perseverance and what was the word you used? Loyalty? Yeah, loyalty. So we come back to where we started. Yeah.
For all intents and purposes, there's no way Malört should have made it to the 21st century.
Totally, completely should not have, yes.
And here we are. One of the things, I was on WGN radio. I did part-time work there in the mid-teens, and I interviewed Sam.
Oh,
who?
Okay.
This was literally 10 years ago this week as we're recording this. I did an interview, and I found his relationship to Malört very perplexing.
Oh,
back then.
perplexing. Perplexing and complex.
Yeah. I didn't really understand it.
Oh, that's interesting.
And I kind of understand it better now, having read the book. But he was a brand ambassador, but not really connected officially at that point.
Was that before? So Sam is one of the handful of major characters, right, that we talk about. There's George, Pat, and then there's these guys, Peter and Chris, who came on, and then Sam was really the fifth. So, yeah, and Sam, again, Malört sort of endured against the odds and in these unlikely ways, and Sam is one of the unlikeliest. He was a Chicago bartender who discovered Malört in about 07-ish, and just fell in love. He thought it was fascinating, and it's as I write in the book, Malört allowed him to sort of be the bartender he wanted to be, the Chicago bartender he wanted to be. He knew the city's coolest secret handshake, and it was something that could start conversations and end conversations and just change someone's night. And he would get the most amazing reactions out of people who were tasting it for the first time, because like everyone's heard of Malört now at this point, basically.
Sure.
Right? We've got 10 years of lore behind it. Back then there was no lore. It was just this oddball mystery, and Sam just saw it as this really fascinating tool to be a really fascinating bartender. And Malört was operated by Pat, who barely even knew what the internet was, and so Sam thought, well, if she's not going to really harness the possibilities of Malört on the internet, I'll do it. So, and he had nothing to do with the company at this point. He was just a fan and a bartender. So he creates the Twitter account and the Facebook account. He didn't quite start the Facebook account, but he took it over from this other fan of Malört. And he became the voice of Malört on the internet, even though he had nothing to do with the company. And then he does the next logical thing, which is, well, if whoever owns Malört isn't going to make Malört T-shirts, I'll make Malört T-shirts. So he starts selling Malört T-shirts. So yes, he was Malört's #1 fan, but by a mile, and basically wound up ultimately working for the company. Pat and her lawyer were going to shut him down because who sells T-shirts on behalf of a company they have nothing to do with and owns the social media handles of a company they have no one to do with? Well, this was Malört in 2008, and so
he cut Pat a check.
Yeah. He sent her a check for, I think it was a couple $100 for the T-shirts. He made much more than that.
Of course.
But you know, it was sort of a little tip of the cap. But he wrote her a letter with the check. He didn't say, I'm selling T-shirts. He just said, thank you for allowing me to make Malört part of my life. Here's some money. So the check never made it to her, though, because he sent it to an old address, and it got a return to sender. So he thought she was dead until she and her lawyer came knocking on his door, saying, knock it off, buddy. But she was so charmed by Sam and his love for Malört, she wound up hiring him.
This is all so improbable. Everything you're saying, Josh, is in this book.
And by the way, the check returned to sender, I said, there's no way that's true. I want to see this check. And guess what? It was in one of the boxes. So it was true.
So you got that access, and you just thought, okay, here it is. I've got the keys to the car. I'm ready to go.
Yeah, basically. Yeah.
What surprised you the most about the discovery process for writing this?
I think what surprised me the most was the depth of the love and the feelings behind Malört. I didn't know why it had survived as long as it had, but I was really surprised at the depth of the passion for Malört that allowed it to survive and then thrive. It had to survive for 80 years, but George Brody had this unusual passion for it, and then Pat was hired as George's secretary, and within a year became his mistress. He was 35 years older than her, and he was married, and they had a relationship for the rest of his life. That it's just all these, and then the new generation of Malört fans. This guy Peter that I mentioned, he was like everything we just talked about Sam. Peter was that, but first, and then there was this tension between Peter and Sam, and it's just it was such a soap opera, and I was just shocked and, as a writer, very pleased, that there was so much to work with there. I never knew that a book about a thing could yield such fascinating backstories of people and relationships.
Business normally works. None of this. There's so much unorthodoxy to every aspect of this story.
Which makes sense since we're talking about Malört, right?
It makes sense. You've written about spirits for years. given the current state of Malört, its stranglehold over Chicago culture, its spread nationally, will this keep going the distance? Will this become Jägermeister at some point and fall off a cliff, or will Malört be with us to stay?
I think Malört is with us to stay. I mean, it's so authentically Chicago, right?
Well, and they moved the distilling to CH here in Chicago, so it's no longer in Florida. It is a local product.
Correct.
Through.
Yeah. So in 2018, Pat did sell it to CH Distillery, which is Chicago-based, and so production came back to Chicago for the first time since the mid-'80s when it went down to Florida, as we talked about before.
And that was a critical move. That had to happen for the brand.
Yeah, and it's really where Malört should be made in Chicago.
Yeah.
Right. So sales at their lowest ever, they sold 1,000 cases a year, which is small. Mm-hmm. When Pat sold the brand in 2018, it was doing about 12 to 15,000 cases a year. So that was really growing. But now, since CH bought it, now they're up to about 35,000 cases a year. So Malört has continued to grow. I think Malört's here to stay. I mean, the interesting thing to me is how far can it go outside Chicago? And it was available only in Chicago for decades. Now it's available in more than 30 states. And, that doesn't mean that it's a sensation across Texas, but in the hip bars of Austin and San Antonio and Houston, yeah, it's doing pretty well. In New Orleans, it's got a nice following. So it's got these pockets. I think places where there are a little more progressive-minded drinkers, I think there's still some runway for Malört. And, if you're a bar in Chicago and you don't have Malört, what are you doing? And I don't think that's going to change. It's just, it's history and authenticity, and there's such sense of place in it that it's part of the Chicago fabric at this point.
Talking about Sam, who kind of went rogue with pretty much everything he did. Mm-hmm. You say this in the book. He believed that not carrying Malört was Chicago barroom malpractice.
Yeah.
That's a great line.
And that's why this is a funny thing about Sam, is so he worked at this bar. Again, this was before Malört was a thing. So it was still, to most people, just, ew, gross. Why would you want to have anything to do with that stuff? So the bar owner of the bar where Sam worked refused to carry it because he thought it was disgusting. Sam couldn't fathom not carrying it, so he would buy bottles himself and mule them into work in his backpack so that he could basically pour free shots. He didn't even really make any money off of it. He just poured it for free, just because it was something to start conversations and make friends and create bonds and experiences at the bar, which arguably to cultivate an experience for the customer, which is really what a great bartender does, right?
Thinking about the brand, and you talk about this in the book, that there's that struggle with how to market Malört. Is it that spirit that makes strangers pucker up and make that face, or is it something where the history should be leaned into?
Yeah, there have been discussions over the years. Well, maybe Malört should take itself a little more seriously as a Swedish spirit, as something from the other side of the Atlantic which carries its own culture with it. And it's just like that just never quite has worked. And I thought what was really interesting was the current owner of Malört, CH, is owned by this guy, Tremaine Atkinson.
Who I talked to on this podcast during COVID.
Oh, okay. Yeah, he's a cool guy.
Yeah.
Very cool guy. And he was getting a little tired of the whole Malört face, oh, it's so gross thing. Mm-hmm. And he was thinking, well, maybe we need to find some fresh avenues to talk about it. This was coming into 2024. So he's sort of thinking, how are we going to talk about the brand in 2024? I'm going to do a little more marketing because he's trying to grow it now. And he thought, well, do we want to lean into something a little more serious, a little more practical? And then the singer-rapper Drake posted on Instagram a picture of Malört that said, I think his caption was just something like, there's no way Chicago actually enjoys this ... something like that. And it blew up, and it got so much engagement and so many likes and so many comments and that stuff's so nasty, bro, and stuff like that. And Tremaine realized, you know what? This is the conversation people want to have about Malört.
Yeah.
And it is. And it's, but then there's always there's a pretty sizable crowd like you and me that just sort of likes it, you know. But I'm glad that I mean, it's not just a product or a thing; it's an experience, and that's a lot of its power. And that's so be it.
In a world where we live on screens, like having a shared experience, that's still meaningful.
Amen. Amen.
Again, it's Malört, The Redemption of a Revered and Reviled Spirit. Great book name. I love this. Was this fun to write?
Oh, it was incredibly fun to write. Yeah.
How long did it take? How many years of research, interviews, etc.?
It took about 2.
Okay.
Which is actually not
That seems
bad at
reasonable,
all.
yeah.
My first book took like 6. So yeah, this one had few characters, which helped, and it's sort of a smaller story than the first one. I mean, the axis spins around Malört. So that's a small thing with few people that were close to the center of it, and that allowed me to sort of speed things along. Whereas the first one, I was trying to tell, in a sense, the entire story of craft beer. You know, so yeah, that took some time. But yeah, so the fact that this had sort of a narrower thread helped. But I also knew for it to be a good book, it couldn't be too narrow of a narrative. It had to tell a broader story, and that's where it comes into sort of Chicago history and really like how cultural tastes changed. I mean, we haven't really talked about how Malört even became popular again, but I knew I had to answer that question.
It's in the book.
And it's in the book, and that was sort of the bigger overarching thing was what happened culturally that allowed something so bitter and that so many people dislike to become so popular, because this could not have happened in the 1990s. It's no coincidence that it happened when it did, and frankly I think where it did. People have asked me, like, could this have happened anywhere? And I do think there's something uniquely Chicago about Malört surviving here as long as it did, and then ultimately thriving here. Could it have happened in Cleveland or Milwaukee? Yeah, maybe. Could it have happened in Dallas? No, absolutely not.
I love this book. It's super interesting. Josh Noel, Malört, The Redemption of a Revered and Reviled Spirit. Great job with this. It's super interesting.
Thanks, man. Appreciate it.